They said she died a virgin. But that was the cover story. The last image we're meant to remember is of a pale queen in pearls and lace, closing her eyes in peace. But what if I told you that wasn't how it ended, not even close? What if the Virgin Queen of England didn't die pure, but poisoned, mutilated, and silenced by the very men who built her legend? March 1603. Richmond Palace reeked of death. Servants burned rosemary to cover the stench, but it didn't work. The smell wasn't of sickness, it was decay. Elizabeth's skin had turned black beneath the white paste she smeared on her face. Her teeth were gone. Her hair, once golden, fell in clumps. Her body refused to rest, even as her mind fractured into whispers. She stood for days, refusing to lie down, terrified that if she did, she'd never rise again. And she was right. But here's what your schoolbooks never mention: before her body even cooled, before her soul left the palace, her chamber was sealed, her bed burned, her letters destroyed, and her death rewritten. Because the truth, the real truth, was too poisonous to touch. You see, Elizabeth I wasn't just a queen. She was a manufactured symbol. The illusion of divine purity masking an empire built on deceit. And when a symbol begins to rot, those who worship it must erase the body before the myth collapses. The real Elizabeth was a psychological experiment that worked too well, a weaponized woman designed to control the minds of men and nations. Her so-called virginity wasn't virtue, it was propaganda, a tool to bind her people under the spell of chastity and fear. But who orchestrated it? Who needed the Virgin Queen to exist? The truth leads straight into the machinery of hidden power, the secret architects who discovered that purity could control hearts better than any sword. Tonight, we descend into the chamber they sealed shut for 4 centuries. The one under Westminster. The one that still smells faintly of lavender and rot. Because beneath the legend of the Virgin Queen lies something sickening, something that whispers through history: the more innocent the mask, the darker the hand beneath it. And once you understand what was done to her, and by whom, you'll never look at royalty, religion, or even femininity the same way again. Now, let's open the first coffin. To understand Elizabeth's so-called purity, you must start with the blood she came from, blood that terrified empires. Anne Boleyn. Her mother. Executed in 1536 under charges of witchcraft, incest, and treason, all lies. But they weren't lies without purpose. Anne's death wasn't punishment, it was ritual. You see, in the court of Henry VIII, executions weren't just politics, they were theater for the gods men secretly served. And Anne? She wasn't just a wife who disobeyed the king. She was a woman who knew too much. She knew about the hidden circles, the monks expelled from monasteries who kept the old symbols alive, the masons and astrologers whispering of celestial bloodlines, and the priests who learned that if you could control a woman's image, you could control the world's desire. Elizabeth saw it all. A child barely 3 years old, watching her mother dragged away, her cries silenced, her name erased. That moment didn't just scar her. It rewired her. Weakness became her enemy. Emotion, her executioner. And so, the child became an experiment. Behind closed doors, a quiet alliance formed: scholars, alchemists, and royal handlers who called themselves the Order of the Veil. Their philosophy was simple: the chaos of man could be ruled through the illusion of chastity. A pure monarch would reflect divine authority, not through lineage, but through abstinence. Elizabeth became their vessel. They raised her not as a woman, but as a symbol, stripping her of touch, of trust, of any capacity to love. Her beauty was weaponized, her loneliness used as fuel. They taught her that her virginity was her empire. That surrendering it meant death. And when she took the throne, that illusion became doctrine. Portraits bathed her in holy light. Bards compared her to the Virgin Mary. The people worshipped her body, but only because they believed no one else could touch it. She was no longer a queen. She was a religion. But the religion wasn't hers. It belonged to the men behind the curtain, the same secret order that erased and Bullen's sin and replaced it with a living idol of obedience. And here's the sickening irony, the Virgin Queen's body became the altar where England sacrificed its truth. Because purity, in their system, was never about the woman. It was about keeping everyone else impure, guilty, and easily ruled. Half a millennium later, their blueprint still rules the world, not with swords or armies, but with symbols and shame. And if you're still here, listening, you're ready to see what the Virgin was really hiding under that crown. By the time Elizabeth turned 60, her body had begun to betray the illusion that sustained her throne. The paint cracked. The flesh beneath rebelled. And the Order of the Veil, those who had once crafted her legend, began to panic. She had become their greatest success, and now, she was becoming their greatest threat. Reports from Richmond Palace whispered of something unnatural. Her skin, once alabaster, began to blacken beneath the ceruse paste, a mixture of white lead and vinegar her alchemists had sworn would preserve her youth. But they had lied. That mixture did not preserve, it poisoned. Slowly. Quietly. Her veins darkened. Her lips bled. Her hair fell in handfuls. Yet she refused to stop. She painted over the rot, the same way her kingdom painted over its corruption. One of her maids, Catherine Howard, wrote that Elizabeth would stare for hours into her mirror, tracing her face with trembling fingers and whispering, "They made me this way." But by then, no one was listening. The courtiers feared her. The clergy obeyed her. The men behind the throne, the invisible advisors, simply watched as their creation decayed from within. Because her suffering was part of the ritual. The order believed that by keeping the Queen's body untouched, they could bind England's collective psyche to her purity. The longer she denied herself human intimacy, the stronger the nation's obedience became. The Queen's loneliness was the people's leash. But something shifted in her final decade. Elizabeth began seeing what she called the shadow men. Figures in black hoods who appeared at her bedside whispering, "Your mother was right." She ordered the candles kept burning day and night, but still, they came. Her doctors called it hysteria. The order called it awakening. And maybe it was. Because Elizabeth began keeping records, private writings in a cipher language only she could read. Pages that spoke of betrayal, of experiments, of how her virginity had been not a vow but a commandment forced by those who feared the return of her mother's fire. Those pages vanished after her death. The only thing that remained was a lock of her hair, green, brittle, and still heavy with lead. Now, here's the question no historian dares to ask: if the Virgin Queen was dying of poison, who kept supplying her with it, and why did she keep taking it? Maybe because she finally understood that her body wasn't her own. It belonged to the myth. To the machine. To the unseen architects who fed off purity like parasites. Because from here, we descend into the deepest layer, where purity turns to power, and the Virgin Queen becomes the prototype for modern control. When Elizabeth died, the Virgin Queen became more powerful than the living woman ever was. The Order of the Veil made sure of it. They understood something terrifying, that death doesn't end influence, it perfects it. A corpse can't contradict the myth. And so, they embalmed her legacy in divine light, turning the most tortured woman in English history into a goddess of restraint, obedience, and loyalty to the crown. But this wasn't just about one queen. It was a prototype. The Virgin Queen became the blueprint for a new form of domination, psychological warfare through image. You see, they learned that if you could make the masses worship purity, they'd never question corruption. If they could convince people to kneel before symbols, they'd never look behind the curtain. Elizabeth's portrait, the pale face, the golden halo of hair, the calm eyes that hid a century of manipulation, became the first government-sponsored illusion. It trained an entire empire to equate beauty with obedience, silence with holiness, and submission with power. The church saw the potential immediately. The crown became divine. Sin became taxable. And purity, that dangerous, manufactured concept, became a weapon that would outlive them all. Look around you. The system hasn't changed. It's just dressed itself in different colors. Modern institutions still use Elizabeth's model, the same psychological mechanics of control. They sell you an image of virtue, then bind you to guilt for not matching it. They glorify the untouchable, then punish the human. Every ad, every influencer, every political speech is built on that same Elizabethan formula, control through contrast. They make you chase the illusion. And while you chase it, they harvest your belief. Elizabeth was the test subject, the living altar, the broken doll that proved how far the human psyche could bend under the pressure of sacred lies. The so-called Virgin Queen didn't rule by divine right, she was ruled by divine manipulation. And the same forces that built her myth learned to weaponize our minds. Think of how power still hides behind innocence. Think of how the most corrupt institutions always drape themselves in purity, in charity, in faith, in patriotism. Different words. Same spell. Because control isn't about chains. It's about narrative. And the moment you believe the story, you're already wearing the crown they built for you. They told the world she died in silence. But silence is never empty. It hides screams. Weeks before Elizabeth's death, servants found a locked chest beneath her bed, one she refused to let anyone touch. It was small, carved with strange sigils, half Christian, half alchemical. When she finally succumbed, the chest vanished from Richmond Palace. Officially, it never existed. Unofficially, fragments of its contents reappeared decades later in coded archives beneath the Bodleian Library. Historians called it the Death Chamber Codex. Its pages weren't written in English. Not Latin, not French, but a ciphered hybrid of ancient symbols and phonetic code, partially decrypted in the 1880s. The fragments that survived spoke of something unthinkable, the Queen's own rebellion against the Order of the Veil. One entry read, "They made me a mask and called it a crown. They fed me poison and called it paint. But I have learned their script, and I will rewrite it with fire." It seems that in her final months, Elizabeth realized what she had become, not a ruler, but a ritual. The order had drained her humanity to feed the myth. And in her madness, or perhaps her clarity, she began plotting to dismantle it. She summoned an alchemist named John Dee, a name you might remember. The man whispered to angels, coded messages for the crown, and mapped empires through geometry. But Dee was more than her astrologer, he was her accomplice. Together, they planned to encrypt her final confession into a form of living code, hidden across paintings, emblems, and coins. You've seen it. The crescent moon above her crown. The serpentine curve of her scepter. The subtle triangle formed by her fingers in portraits. Each was part of a secret pattern, a warning she left for those with eyes to see, the Virgin was never pure. The purity was the prison. But before the message could spread, the order struck. Dee vanished, his manuscript seized. Elizabeth's personal attendants were either executed or sent into silence. The chest beneath her bed, gone. Only a few pages survived, hidden behind false bindings, preserved by one of her maids who later disappeared under mysterious circumstances in Antwerp. The codex's last line reads, "The mask cracks. The serpent returns to the garden." What did she mean? Some say she foresaw the rebirth of the order, their evolution into modern institutions of power, finance, and faith. Others say she left a cipher that, if decoded, reveals where her real remains were buried, not in Westminster, but somewhere the church would never dare look. She was trying to break the system that created her. But the system buried her instead. And centuries later, we still live under her shadow. After Elizabeth's death, the Order of the Veil didn't vanish. It metamorphosed. The veil itself became invisible, stitched into the language of empire, science, and faith. No longer robed alchemists muttering Latin in candlelight. Now, they wore wigs and seals and titles like Lord Chancellor, Governor, Bishop, and later, Minister. The ritual had evolved into governance. They learned something profound from Elizabeth's reign: controlling the soul was far more efficient than ruling the body. So they turned the Queen's tragedy into a template for civilization. Every system of mass influence that rose afterward, the colonial church, the British East India Company, the secret Masonic lodges of the 17th century, even the early press, all carried fragments of the Veil's philosophy: keep the masses enamored with purity, and they will defend their own chains. In other words, make them love the crown that kills them. When the empire expanded, missionaries were sent ahead of soldiers, spreading the same psychological poison: virtue as obedience, morality as submission, sin as rebellion. Sound familiar? It's the same formula used today, just wrapped in corporate slogans and social validation. The crown became a logo. The pulpit became a screen. And the same emotional architecture that imprisoned Elizabeth's soul was replicated billions of times, in classrooms, advertising, politics, even love itself. They discovered the holy trinity of control: desire, shame, dependence. Feed desire, enforce shame, create dependence, and the mind becomes programmable. Elizabeth's isolation was no accident, it was the prototype. Today, isolation is digital. You're connected to everyone and still feel alone, because the system doesn't need you united. It needs you manageable. Every culture that worships purity still kneels at Elizabeth's altar: the untouched woman, the flawless leader, the saintly brand. It's all theater. And the directors are the descendants of the same architects who watched a dying queen beg for freedom and called it holiness. So, when you scroll through perfection, the filtered faces, the godlike politicians, the moral crusades, remember, you are witnessing the reincarnation of the Veil. It never ended. It just rebranded. The same energy that fed on Elizabeth's purity now feeds on your attention. Every click is incense. Every confession is currency. And the most dangerous part? You're told it's all your choice. But the real power lies not in obedience, it lies in awareness. The moment you see the manipulation, the spell breaks. The mask falls. And that's why you're here, not to consume another dark story, but to wake up inside it. They say her final words were, "I am tired of standing." But that's not what was written in the hidden accounts smuggled from Richmond Palace by her last surviving attendant. According to that document, her final words were whispered into the ear of a priest, not a royal chaplain, but a man sent in secret from Cambridge, part of the underground network of scholars who studied forbidden languages and codes. She grasped his wrist, her nails blackened from poison, and said, "Tell them the crown was never mine. It belongs to the silence beneath it." Then she died standing, her body too rigid to collapse, as if even death needed permission. But what was the silence? Some say she meant the grave. Others believe she was speaking of the order, the invisible consciousness that has guided kings, bishops, and governments for 500 years. The silence beneath every flag, every prayer, every institution that demands loyalty while preaching virtue. After her death, strange things happened. The wax effigy of Elizabeth placed at her funeral procession, sculpted before her body had even cooled, bore a different expression than any living portrait. The mouth slightly open, the eyes turned downward, not toward heaven but toward something unseen, something below. It's the only statue of her where she looks afraid. Whispers spread that her ghost was seen walking the halls of Whitehall, not as a queen, but as a pale figure with blackened lips, murmuring, "They took my name." The clergy called it superstition. The order called it containment. But her warning survived, encoded in letters, symbols, and allegories that now lace our culture. The sickening reason the Virgin Queen never married wasn't chastity. It was ownership. Her body, her choices, even her myth, all belonged to the same silence she tried to name. And that silence never died. It simply learned how to hide in plain sight. Every time you're told to obey, for the greater good, every time truth is censored in the name of peace, every time innocence is weaponized to shame those who question, you are hearing the same whisper that ruled Elizabeth's England. The silence beneath the crown. The machine that feeds on purity and fear. But she left a key. It's hidden not in churches or vaults, but in men who refuse to kneel. In those who see the illusion for what it is and no longer fear the truth that freedom begins after the myth dies. If you've made it this far, you've already crossed that line. You've already heard the words that were never meant for mortal ears. And if you feel that shift inside, that quiet awareness, anchor it now in the comments with the phrase, "The crown does not own me." Because this is not just history. It's initiation. A descent that doesn't end in darkness, but in clarity. And remember this, the Virgin Queen never truly died. She was transformed into the first mask of modern power. And every man who learns to see through that mask, is no longer ruled by it.